The first time I remember seeing him was when I was 7 years old. He came up to our back door in a ragged jacket with sleeves so long they covered even the tips of his fingers completely, and he didn't bother saying a word to any of us. He just sat down at the table, beside where I was doing my homework, and waited. My mother, haggard from lack of sleep and amphetamines, grabbed me by the shoulder and hustled me out of the room, not even giving me a chance to get my book first. I sat on my bed quietly until I thought it'd be fine to go back, but my boredom led me to misjudge the time. So I returned to the kitchen doorway a few minutes later to find the man bent over a plate of chicken, devouring it like a starving animal. He looked up momentarily to give me a grin with his dirty yellow teeth, and I ran back to my room before I could get in trouble. Visitors like him weren't uncommon in the house I grew up in. My dad left when I was too young to remember him, and my mom had been addicted to various drugs since I was born. It was a wonder she was allowed custody of me at all. But when I asked her about our visitor the next morning, she froze up. Who was Mr. Longsleeves? Mr. Who? She never really understood my tendency to give people nicknames based on their features. I never grew out of it, but now I've at least learned to keep it to myself. He came over last night. He ate our chicken. It was then her voice caught uncomfortably, and I could tell her knuckles were gripping the steering wheel a little bit tighter than usual. Mr. Longsleeves is just a special friend. Don't talk about him anymore. The terminology she used stuck in my young mind as being a little unusual. Most of the men who came to visit were my uncles, or they were more of my mom's boyfriends who called me sport and asked that I call them by their first names. So, of course, when I told a friend on the playground about my mom's new special friend with the very funny coat, I used the same phrasing, and he laughed in my face. A few choice words came from him about my mother, and I punched him hard enough to break his glasses. It got me a week of detention, and I stopped telling people about the visitors who came to my house. Mr. Longsleeves visited a few more times during my childhood and never said a word to me. I'd slink to my room without being asked when he arrived, and I'd come out in an hour or two once he'd left. The visits tapered off the older I got, and when I left home at 18 I thought I'd never see any of my mom's old friends again. I was wrong, of course. My life has gone well the past few years. I'm married to a lovely woman, and we bought our first house a few months ago. Right before I got the news that my mother had passed. We hadn't seen each other in a couple of years. She never wanted a child to begin with, and even though she was a decent enough mother sometimes, her drug use and general lack of caring meant she was never there when I needed her. I went to her funeral out of a sense of obligation and went to her house to collect whatever was in good enough shape to donate right after I left. There wasn't much, just a few pieces of furniture that weren't too rickety and some dishes that my wife insisted on keeping because they're your mother's fine china. Also included in the box of things that would go to my garage were a couple of old notebooks, journals she'd kept. I didn't care too much about them, but felt a sense of obligation to keep them anyways. A couple weeks later I found myself home alone, sick with the flu that's been going around as of late. And who did I see when I looked out the window but the same ragged man I'd seen in my kitchen all those years ago, walking across the yard with a white, awkward limp. I locked the door before he could get close, but I didn't bother with grabbing my phone to call the cops just yet. He was just one of my mom's old crackhead friends, and she probably told him where I lived before she died. Nothing I couldn't deal with. I heard a muffled pounding on the door before he should have made it close enough to knock. But when I looked out the window, there he was on the steps, his eyes dark and tired, and his body covered in the same old coat from forever ago. And then, another muffled pounding as he knocked on the door again. Or, rather, as he hit it. The motion his arm made wasn't a knock as much as it was a jerking punch, his arm held at an uncanny angle, and his wrist bent to the side, so his fist hit the door straight on. When I opened it to ask him to leave, he simply strode past me in one fluid motion and sat down at the table. It was then that I began to notice exactly how unusual his appearance was. Have you ever seen those pictures, the ones that point out bizarre inaccuracies in advertisements? A model will have an extra finger or two, or there's a hand where one shouldn't quite be. Mismatched shoes, extra arms. Things that on first glance make you a little unnerved, but only serve to bring more attention to the image, unless you've got especially keen eyes. Well, Mr. Longsleeves was like a human version of that. I couldn't help but stare for a moment as my brain kept connecting dots of things that shouldn't have been the way they were. His teeth, yellow and brown, were too long in his smiling mouth. His hand, flat on the table, was twisted left at a 90-degree angle. And I was almost certain there was more, but I snapped out of the trance before I looked any further. My voice was as firm as I could make it, but it still cracked with fear as I told him to get out. His unblinking eyes acknowledged me with close, careful scrutiny, but he didn't move and replied with only one word in a gravelly voice. "Food." "I'm not giving you anything," I said, my voice emboldened a little by fear. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't at least a little uneasy by now. "Get the fuck out of my house before I call the cops." His smile wavered and he reached out one long, bendy arm and grabbed my cell phone, which sat on the other end of the table. Before I could react, he opened his mouth like a constrictor and put it in. Crunch. Crunch. A loud swallow. It was gone. His smile returned. "Food," he said again, this time his voice a bit clearer, more assertive. I opened the fridge and grabbed the plastic bag containing last night's leftover fried chicken and dumped it out on the table in front of him before retreating to the corner, my hands shaking. He picked up the meat, his hands still buried in their long sleeves, and devoured it. Bones and all. It took what seemed like an eternity for him to be done, but finally he'd finished. He stood up, went to my sink, turned on the water, and cupped his covered hands to collect some. He bent his head down to drink as much as he had, which probably wasn't much. And then he left, not bothering to give me another glance. I cleaned the table and when my wife got home I didn't breathe a word of what had happened to her. When she asked about the chicken, I told her I'd eaten it. She was frustrated when I told her I'd dropped my phone outside and couldn't find it, but she accepted it. I still wasn't sure if whatever it was real, and I didn't want to make her worry that the neighborhood was unsafe. So I just didn't bring it up. The nightmares started the next day. I couldn't close my eyes without seeing him, hearing his laugh and the sickly noises he made as he ate. So eventually I just stopped trying to sleep and downed as much coffee as I could instead. I spent more and more time at home instead of at work in an effort to make sure I was there for his visits. They've started to happen every week, but I can never manage to predict when. I try to stay ready. Eventually my wife is going to start to notice that my checks are shorter and I'm not leaving the house as much. But I have to do this. I'm worried that if I don't, he's going to hurt her. Or, heaven forbid, our future child. I've been meaning to read those journals as of late to see if my mother had written anything about our mutual special friend. But it's hard to read when you're as tired as I am. Maybe they have something useful. Ways to keep him out of your head. Anything. Maybe I'll move. Start staying at a motel, someplace public. Or I'll set traps. It's almost like he can sense what I'm thinking, though, because he's seemed angrier as of late. I don't know what he's going to take next.